Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being with us tonight for this live Tenant Farmers Association webinar, which tonight is looking at what does success look like for the new commissioner for the tenant farming sector. Now, my name is George Dunn. I'm the Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, and you might have been expecting Robert Martin, our National Chair, to be in the host chair for this evening, but for various reasons, Robert is not available this evening, and he has therefore asked me to do it, and I am delighted to do so. And I should also say that we are being sponsored by Roythorns Solicitors. Now, those of you who don't know Roythorns, it is a national firm of solicitors steeped in agriculture. They've got about 90 years experience in advising landowners and tenants alike, and their lawyers are active in many policy groups, including tenancy policy groups, so they do get the bigger picture. So whether it's about a succession application or a new farm business tenancy or a dispute with your landlord, which we might hear a bit more about later on this evening, or even a new collaborative natural capital agreement, Roythorns is there to assist. So if you miss any of tonight's webinar, or you are wanting to rewatch it, then it will be recorded, and once it is recorded, it'll be edited and then available on our YouTube channel. And you can find our YouTube channel if you search at Tenant Farmers, and there you will find a massive library of information, our virtual events, our knowledge share, teach-ins, news updates. We encourage you to go and have a look at that, to subscribe to the channel, and in that way you'll be notified as and when we have new content uploaded there. So as I say, to find us, just search at Tenant Farmers. So tonight we are absolutely delighted to welcome Alan Laidlaw, who has recently been announced as the new commissioner for the tenant farming sector, something which the TFA has been lobbying for hard as a recommendation from the ROC review into agricultural tenancies, which is now 3 years old. It was October 2022 when that was published. And Alan has 25 years leadership experience across public, private, and charitable organizations. He is, it tells me here, a respected figure in UK rural and agricultural circles. I'm sure that is true. During his time at the Crown Estate, he oversaw one of the country's largest tenanted estates and introduced innovative tenancy agreements and co-investment models that delivered sustainable growth for both tenants and the landlord. He later led the Royal Horticultural and Agricultural Society of Scotland, a charity best known for delivering the Royal Highland Show, where he championed sustainability, innovation, and community engagement. He's also a founding trustee of Farm Strong Scotland and a fellow of the Royal Agricultural Society. So I'm going to invite Alan in a minute just to give us an overview of his role and how he sees it and what success looks like. And then we will have a question and answer session with Alan, which is your opportunity then to engage directly with Alan tonight. So if you do have any questions, please go to the Q&A box, which you will see on screen, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and put your questions in there. And I will pick them up when Alan has finished his presentation and we get into the Q&A. I also have received some in advance, which we'll cover as well, as much as we possibly can. So thanks again, Alan, for joining us. I think this is your first public outing, and we will be really delighted to hear what you've got to say to us tonight. So Alan, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. George, thank you for your kind introduction. Yeah, I suppose the introduction of the role of tenant farming sector commissioner is very timely. I want to cover a little bit about myself, a little bit about the process of how we've got here, and also just where we're at the moment and what we're trying to do. As George said, this is my first public outing. There's quite a lot of process stuff happening at the moment, and a few development pieces to be put together to allow us to really take us steps into the next sort of phase of the Commissioner's Office and allow you to have that two-way engagement with the office and with myself and the team. And we'll touch on that today. We'll give a little bit of background on where some of this discussion has come from. George has touched on the ROC review, but also on the response to that and where we're at. We'll touch on the forum, Farm Tenancy Forum, and then we'll touch on some of the processes that we're just developing at the moment, and then we'll have that Q&A, as George says. So if we move on to the next slide. George has covered a lot of this, so I've got a background in terms of rural property, business and finance. I did 11 years looking after the Crown Estate portfolio, looked after the UK rural-wide portfolio, and then led on Scotland and ports and harbours and renewables as well. So I've got a fairly broad experience of different types of agreements, of different types of tenancies and business, and ultimately a lot of experience, hopefully, that's relevant to this role, that can mean that we understand what good looks like. And I thought the title for this evening was good, because at the moment I'm still developing what good looks like for me in a new role, and the type of engagement that we'll get from this type of event, the type of engagement that you'll not be surprised that George and Robert have already been having with my office, helps us, make that as a joint plan. One of the things I'm really conscious of is that it's not for me to come in with my historic views and say, this is what the challenges are, this is what's going well, this is what's not. It's very much a role about engagement. And so there's a blog on the DEFRA website where I've tried to set out a little bit more about my early thinking. We'll continue to develop that, and I know that's been well read through and sort of looked at over the last few weeks. So if you want to keep an eye on that, please do so. And we'll try and make sure that you've got a chance to filter and to engage with what's going on, as I'm sure George will keep you informed, as the team will from the TFA. So if we move on to the next slide. So the Commissioner's role, as George touched on, some of you will be really familiar with the ROC review, as George said, October 22, a lot of recommendations in there and quite a substantial response sought to benefit the health of the tenanted sector. And for me, I watched with interest as that process happened, as people gave views, and when the report came out. And that was as an interested party in the success of the tenanted sector. I've always been a fan of a thriving agricultural community. And without the tenanted sector and without the flexibility that tenancies and different types of agreements give us, it's very difficult to deliver on all of the different demands that agriculture is placed upon at the moment, whether that be food security, whether it be environmental and nature benefits. That structure of landlord-tenant and partnership for me is really important. So I was an interested observer in the ROC review process, and I suppose didn't ever think that this would necessarily come about as my role, but that's where we are now, and I'm excited to be in that role because I'm excited to see what opportunities there are for the tenanted sector. So up here on the slide, it's very clear that the role of the Commissioner is to try and promote and develop collaborative relationships, to work with everyone in the sector, whether they be a landlord, a tenant, an agent, an advisor, a solicitor. And one of the things that's been coming really loud and clear over the last few weeks is that the range of people that are involved in discussing different forms of agreement and tenancies is probably wider than many people think. It's not just the sort of 3 or 4 type of individuals are in there. So it's about making sure that we can engage with that whole sector and ultimately be able to have an impartial and confidential area for discussion about where things are not going so well. So I suppose for me, it's about working on where we see things that go well, celebrating those and promoting best practice. It's about a reporting element into DEFRA and to make sure they understand what's happening on the ground on a day-to-day basis. but also then being able to have a process around where things aren't working so well, or where behaviours or actions that are undertaken, whether it be by tenant or landlord, by agent or solicitor, or anyone involved in this process, really don't meet the standards that we would consider to be appropriate. We are a department office based within the DEFRA Agri-Food Chain Directorate. Some of you might know the supply chain adjudicator Richard Thompson's work. He is also, so we've formed a small office within DEFRA, which is outside, I suppose, the normal policy land, looking to make sure that we've got the right processes and people in place to keep that impartiality away from that policy side of things. So Richard and my offices are sitting within the Agri-Food Chain Directorate, but very much as a separate piece. So from that point of view, we are, from my perspective, at day 15 or 16 in terms of process, relatively clear white piece of paper to start with. The team in the department and the policy team were very clear to make sure that we get to set the team and the processes up as we wish, which I'm delighted about. It does mean that we didn't have something oven ready just to flick a switch on at the moment. So if you go looking on the DEFRA website, you won't find a great deal about the Commissioner's office, but that's because we're developing it as we speak. And I suppose that's a good time just to pause on the level of engagement that George and Robert and the team at the TFA have had in this process. Ultimately, there's been a lot of discussion over a number of years about what a commissioner would look like. There's been a lot of input and views and sort of feeding in of that. There's been a significant amount of discussion through the forum. And I met Robert there a couple of weeks ago at the most recent forum meeting. And for me, the fact that we've been able to create this role and get the support for this role and get it in place is testament to the hard work for all of the people who have really pushed for that. And that makes a difference, because without that, this could have been a recommendation that sat on sort of dusty shelves, but now we're bringing it to life. And I really appreciate the support that everyone's put to that process, both before I was appointed, since I've been appointed, and what I know that people will bring to that process as we go on. So my sincere thanks to the TFA and other membership organisations and professional organisations that have really put their shoulder to that wheel, because without that, I don't think we would be here. And without the political support, that wouldn't be here either. So going forward, I think, what are we wanting to achieve in terms of the code? We want people to understand what the code of good practice is, and those three sort of straplines at the bottom probably summarise where I come from it. If everybody knows what they're doing and why they're doing it, and has clarity of objective and what good looks like for them, back to the title of this evening's webinar is, then that clarity helps everyone understand what's there. If everyone can communicate in as open and clear a way as possible, understanding of each other's positions should be more easily achieved. And if there is an understanding and a degree of agreement around collaboration, I've got a relatively simple view on the landlord-tenant relationship, on the professional relationship, is, if we can make the cake bigger through mutual investment, time of effort, and potentially of capital or cash or entrepreneurial spirit or contacts and things like that, then it's easier for the slice to be sliced up and that side of things. And I'm really conscious that some of you are sitting at home saying, well, the economics of my farming at the moment are very challenging. I completely understand that. I get that. And I will, continue to discuss that with my DEFRA colleagues. But that's not something I've got a magic wand over, and I don't want to get bogged down in terms of those challenges, because I'm very acutely aware that they exist. So if we can have those three areas of sort of communication, clarity, and collaboration as core tenets of what the office looks like and how that works, I would hope that we would be in a better place than we are in the past. But I'm not naive enough to not realize that that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of buy-in. Talking of buy-in, George has been very clear that he's set out his stall in the Farmer's Guardian and in his blog post the other day about what good looks like. Never one to miss a trick to tell me where he sees it. There's a lot in there that I agree with. There's a lot in there that is simple to ask for and more challenging to deliver. And ultimately, over the next couple of months, we'll be able to develop our thinking around that and try and, draw some consensus around what can be achieved. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So for me, we've got three core priorities in the team. First, and this is a great example, is this engage, the outreach and promotion of the role of the office and of where we're at. Without that, we could be sitting in a little office, blissfully unaware of what was going on, and with people not really sure about what happens next now the commissioner's role has been created, and that side of things. So the timing worked well, that just a few days after I was appointed, they had the forum, so I was able to get in front of forum members and outline that to them. And I'm grateful to yourselves for putting a webinar like this on tonight to be able to do that. Ultimately, I want there to be a conversation around the tenant farming sector, around the Commissioner's office, around the Commissioner's role, and ultimately about what good looks like in landlord-tenant relationships and professional relationships with yourselves as members of the TFA. And that's a conversation that I don't want to stop over the next couple of months. I want it to continue, and I want to be able to hear that people are having a different type of conversation potentially to say, look, this is how it was in the past, this is what I want to see for the future. Moving next into the influence side of things, I would like people to be openly talking about the code of practice. I would like them to be doing a sort of sense check themselves. I've looked at the code and I've looked at it and I think, well, actually, am I doing the things that are in here? And the word should comes up in every sort of paragraph, really. And it's, should am I be doing these things? Am I operating within the code, within the spirit of the code? And if I'm not, why is that? And can I understand why somebody else might be able to have a look at that? Because it's only when we reflect on our own sort of values and behaviours that we'll have a really clear understanding of why that might be having an effect on others or having an impact. And at the same time, if you're then able to say to your counterpart or some of your advisors, have you looked at the code? Have you thought about the last few interactions that we've had? Has this been, the spirit in what's been happening there? And at that point, we might have a clearer understanding of what's going on the ground and where things lie. And I think that's really important to have that reflection. And as we go later on in the presentation, we'll talk about some of the process elements. I think, there will be questions that come up if you wanted to raise a concern or an issue that will ask you to contemplate that before you do that, just to have real clarity on where you believe that sits. And only at that stage then will we start to look to resolve and unblock any issues that we think that the code is not being followed and investigate where those sit. And I think I said to George very early in our conversations in this process that he'll have a better handle on how many and what type of concerns come to the office, because he's been in his role for so long and dealing with these type of things, and I'll have a really good handle on that, as will other professionals in the sector. And this investigate part is probably something that's taken up quite a lot of our time at the moment around the office functions, about setting up processes, making sure data is safe and secure, making sure that everyone is treated with the opportunity of respect and an investigation where we think it's needed. It's also at that point that we'll have to be clear is that we are a very small team at the moment, and we don't know what size of wave is coming down the burn. Is it a little bit of water, or is it a tidal wave? I don't know. And I suspect nobody really does know that. So there will have to be a triage process. We will have to look at how those are prioritised and how we understand what's taken forward and what's not as a formal complaint, and also how we process those. So I would ask that there's a bit of patience in there, because I'm not going to be able to answer all of those at once. and I want to make sure that we can triage those, as I say, to make sure that people who are, potentially really time critical elements are being dealt with. We've been working as a team, and we're just recruiting some new members to the team, but our values at the moment that we've developed are down at the bottom of this page. George has been really clear, and others in the industry, to say that we have to develop an evidence-based sort of position of knowledge. We need to be clear and impartial, and that we need to have a trusted operation. And those are things that are absolutely core to me in terms of my approach and my history of working in the agriculture community. Without that trust, without that evidence base, and without understanding why we're doing it, it's very difficult for us to deliver anything like the service that I think can be judged. And one of my personal views on the Tenants Commissioner role is, ultimately, it's been very clearly set up with a review process. This isn't an ad nauseum sort of piece. This is a 2-year process that will be reviewed. And, George, Robert, the office bearers of the Tenant Farmers Association and others will be asked through the forum and other forums to say, do we think that it's working? And I think that's a really honest way for a department to be set up, is to have that stakeholder engagement. Back to those core values we talked about before, is, we have to get that engagement piece right, or otherwise, when that sort of feedback loop is set up and closed, it's very difficult for anyone to say, yep, it's an absolute success and we've seen progress. And it'd be very easy for it to come back and say, no, we don't think we're there yet. And that's something I'm entirely clear about from the start, and have been with the team. And that impartiality piece, we want to be really clear. We are not dealing with DEFRA's policy elements of landlord and tenant and farm tenancies, but we will be a trusted advisor from the industry through organisations like yourselves back into DEFRA. And I would hope that impartiality allows us to say, you've heard this from the TFA before, you've heard this from the CLA, or you've heard this from it, in the past, but actually this is really what's happening on the ground at the moment. And those conversations have already happened with some DEFRA colleagues very recently. And I think it's been a welcome advance for some of my DEFRA colleagues to be able to have that as a sort of impartial question, say, what do you think of this? Do you think this is right? And I've been able to say, well, I have, or I haven't got any evidence yet, but this is what I think. And I think that's a strong place for us to come from. And it's not something that maybe people understood around that trusted advisor. One of the key things about reporting back is I will have to report back on trends from the sector and the feedback that I'm getting to the forum. And I think, again, that sort of impartiality piece back into the forum is really going to help membership organisations. Rather than just saying, I've got 10 pieces of paper here that says these are the problems, we will have a data set. We will have real records that say these are the sort of trends, these are the analysis that we've been able to undertake. So when you see, if you go forward over the next few months and you end up going through the form on the DEFRA website, a lot of that data captures to make sure that we've got really good stats to be able to generate that. Because at the moment, probably that filing cabinet that we can see over George's shoulder is probably the best stat that we've got around some of these issues. And it's not in a DEFRA format, and it's not something that we're able to access for obvious reasons. So it might seem process heavy at times, and I'm not a big heavy process person. I like to get things done in as efficient a manner as possible, but we will need to collect that data to make sure it's robust and really helps inform that process. So we'll move on from there. Yep. We've touched on the forum. I thought it was just worthwhile reminding who's all been in the room for the last few years and who's set that up. And another night, George can do a webinar on the code of conduct and how that was sort of pulled together by those organisations and those individuals in those rooms. But I really would commend anyone to just pick up the code, have a look through it, and challenge themselves to say, right, I'm going to hold a mirror up to myself. I'm going to understand what the code's all about, and I'm going to apply that to myself. And then I always think a really good idea is to work out why the other half of the discussion or other side of any discussion is behaving in a certain way, is to ask that question of them and there, and that might help us. So I think the forum's done a great job so far, and I think that the level of dialogue between policymakers and the industry is far more established and clear now. And I know from my speaking to DEFRA colleagues is that they have a really good view on where the forum's coming from, and they can feed into that side of things, which is great and to be celebrated, and really, that having that pumping sort of information straight into the heart of DEFRA is a good place to be from that perspective. We'll now come on to a little bit more of the detail as it stands at the moment. So the terms of reference, are for us to monitor the uptake of the code of practice. So that's really clear: is do people know about it? Are they using it? Is it commonly discussed in the sector? And I think anecdotally, there's mixed reports on that. So I look forward to hearing that over the next few weeks and months and really establish where that's there. I won't do a poll to see who knows about the code and who's been using it. I'm sure George has been promoting it, and I'm sure that you are all familiar with it. But just take that time to maybe have a look at there, and that leads into that transparency. We need to create a service that is able to provide that confidential and impartial point of contact for people in the sector to raise concerns. That's what we're working at the moment. That includes data protection, data security, privacy notices, and all the type of things that you would expect to make sure that your personal information and information that relates to you and your agreements is really looked after carefully. Engagement professional regulators and professional bodies, that happens at the moment. The next step is to really try and coordinate those and to establish those trends and that side of things. And that's not something that any one organization's done in the past. If it has, it's probably been done for what would potentially be described as their purposes rather than general purposes. And that's something that we need to do. We've already begun to undertake that. And then in terms of that, reports, insights, and research, that's ultimately, we want to be able to say what's required by the tenant sector, what's needed and what's going well, and then go from there. And really probably pulling threads of work that potentially already exist into one version of the truth for the tenant farming sector in England, which sounds simple, but won't be, I know. So we'll keep on progressing with that. And moving on. This is a rough outline, hot off the press. And when I say hot off the press, I mean sort of 3:30 this afternoon. This is the type of way that we think that we're going to be taking inquiries or concerns forward from you and your colleagues in the sector, and how we'll look to formalise that process. So that is, an advanced draft, and that is what is informing us in terms of our web content. It's us training the team, us making sure the policies and procedures that sit behind those. So ultimately, there will be informal engagement like tonight, where we can take views and that sort of things. There'll be informal conversations through the next few months and years around the sector, but then there'll be slightly more formals where people can share experience and confidence as an inquiry, or if they believe that they would like to issue a formal complaint or concern or issue, then they'll go through a slightly more sort of detailed process. And that's to make sure that people feel comfortable sharing information with us, feel sure that the process is robust and impartial, because I'm very conscious that many people in the discussion are nervous about undertaking a sort of formal complaint process if they think that that's going to have a knock-on back on their livelihood and their family life or on the future of their tenancy. I'm very conscious of the sort of things that George has pushed forward in terms of your member surveys and some of the statistics in terms of behaviours and things like that. So I don't want our office to do anything that would cause any issues back on the tenant side of things, and want to make sure that it's really clear about the process. So that, as I say, is hot off the press from about 3:30 this afternoon, and will be developed and sort of iterated as we get forward into the next few months. That'll be on the DEFRA website probably by the end of this week or the early next week. So you are seeing it, ahead of that. So don't be surprised if it changes and if we just iterate it. But ultimately, it'll be about how you engage with us, how we develop that information, where we have the follow-up check, and then we go to the next steps. I think one of the key things is that we will not take the next step to contact any other parties until we've got your full consent from that side of things. So I think hopefully, George, that will give people some reassurance that an email into the commissioner or a formal contact doesn't immediately set a sort of domino train off that they're not in control of. Hopefully that's clear, but as I say, it's very much policy and development rather than completed. So bear that in mind. I'm sure somebody's screen grabbed it already and will be sort of looking at it in detail. To be able to give you something, I wanted to be able to grab something from today, but this will change and it will be developed, and I will continue to say that and remind George of it if he comes winging into my inbox saying this box number 3's changed or something like that. Okay, so that's a bit of the sort of heavier stuff that will come over the next coming weeks. And as I say, we're hoping to have that side of things live into the website late this week, early next week. But that still means we are developing the backhouse processes around that. So it will take some time to formulate that. And I want to really make sure people understand that. Okay, next slide. And ultimately, I mentioned the blog earlier. I think Julia's popped it into the webinar chat with the link to there. That is the Commissioner for the Tenant Farming Sector mailbox at the office. That's manned by the team, and that's the initial place to be in contact with us if you've got a sort of general inquiry, and then look at the website side of things. So George, once we get the website up and running, we'll send that to you and you can put that on whatever resources you put out to your members. And then we can go from there and maybe understand a little bit more about the process. But as I say, we don't quite have that yet. So that is work in progress. I will draw breath and get a quick drink of water and we can move on from there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alan, for that overview, which is obviously going to land really well with our members. First time they're hearing from you, first time they've got the opportunity to see the whites of your eyes in terms of how they're going to be engaging you going forward. But I wanted to get this question out of the way up front, Alan. So obviously you have a history of working for the Crown Estate in England and in Scotland. And no doubt we will have members on this webinar tonight and others who will watch it on catch up who will say, I remember Alan when he was at the Crown. Isn't he just going to be a landlord's man? Isn't he going to come with a landlord's agenda to this role? How do you answer people that you are going to be an independent voice here?
Yeah, so I did 10 years at the Crown Estate. I did 3 or 4 years in banking and was working on behalf of a lot more tenants as I was landlords at that point. And I've done 8 years at RAS, which was representing the whole sector. I go back, George, to my point earlier, is ultimately it's about the health of the sector. And I am a frustrated farmer, as many land agents, 1 or 2 of them are on the call tonight, they would love to be a farmer and they can't be, so therefore they became a land agent. I am a real passionate agriculturalist and I want to see the sector thrive. And if we've got poor behaviours and entrenched views in the tenanted sector from either side of the discussion, that's a bad place for us to be able to hit those wider land use objectives, whether it be food and farming or nature benefits. And I think the benefit that the tenant farming sector has is that you've got an opportunity to benefit all of those, benefit landlords, benefit tenants, and have mutual success. I suppose I'm trying to find that little sweet spot in the Venn diagram that says that we're all mutually benefiting from a relationship. That is dystopianly naive at times, but there will be places where it's happening. And already there are some really good best practice examples. You highlighted one from the National Trust the other day. It was at Amy Greenway and that side of things, where that relationship with a new entrant tenant was working very well. You've also recently highlighted new agreements from the Crown Estate in terms of their EFBT. Well, I'm pretty sure the first version of the EFBT was the FBT Plus, and that had my fingerprints all over it back in the day as well. So, my success and the office's success will be judged on us being trusted and impartial. And if we just, sit on the landlord side of the fence, I'm sure you'll be an able advocate to say that we're getting it wrong and you won't miss your target. So it's not in our interests to get that wrong.
Right, thanks, Alan. And I wasn't surprised that you mentioned the FBT plus work that you did for the Crown a little while ago. Stephen Bumstead, who's one of our members, has put a comment in the chat who thinks you're going to be facing a tsunami of matters and complaints and non-engagement of agents on their behaviour. And you referred to the survey work that we have been doing with our members, but what's your take on the state of the sector and its current performance on conduct, and where do you see your top priorities will be?
I think that it's very early days. And as always, when you start a process like this, there'll be some very vocal voices that come out and say it's all dreadful. And then there's some very vocal voices coming out and saying it's all great and there's no need for it. And I need to spend the next few months just establishing where that baseline is and making sure that we know where that is. My personal view is that the code needs to be discussed more. It's sort of reached the easy to reach corners of the tenant farming sector, but it's not reached the dark corners. And I think that's a conversation that we can all shine a light on in terms of that code. And how that goes forward, I don't know as to what level of flow we'll get in the river, whether it's a trickle, whether it's a flood, or whether it's a tsunami. And I am waiting to, try and prepare for all of those eventualities. And that's why we're trying to be really realistic about managing expectations about how quickly we can deal with all of those if they do come forward at that sort of level.
I think that if it is a tsunami, Mr. Bumstead might be at the front end of that tsunami in terms of the issues that he is currently facing. But to another question, Emma Sturdy is on tonight. Emma is an amazing lady who's been battling an issue with a solar energy scheme on her holding. Is going to make half her holding effectively disappear. But she has said that she has heard you say that you want landlords and tenants to live and breathe the code of practice. But she asks, what are you going to do if landlords dig their heels in and don't play ball? What power do you have to hold the parties to account?
Yeah, I think ultimately, this is a role that doesn't have statutory powers, George, and you have talked about that in the past, and it's something that I'm sure lots of people will want to discuss. It's not something I'm going to discuss for quite a while because ultimately I want to get into the door and see how this develops. Ultimately, we can't make people behave in a certain way, but we can shine a light on what behaviours are happening and why they might be happening and try and understand that. And ultimately, if people choose to, in those words, dig their heels in, and we've got a chance to shine a light on those poor behaviours, to talk around them at the forum, and that may well mean that things then are developed on the back of those. And ultimately, I would hope that no landlord, no tenant, no agent, no solicitor, no advisor wants to dig their heels in when the vast majority of people recognise that the Code of Good Practice has been developed probably with most membership organisations feeding into it, with good buy-in. And there has to be a reason why somebody is choosing not to dig their heels in on that. And I think that it will be unpicking that we need to see where we've got to.
You kindly referred to my shopping list that I set out for you in the Farmers Guardian article just recently, and one of the or two of the items on the shopping list, perhaps I could just draw you out on tonight, were firstly, where you see your role in terms of encouraging landlords and tenants to include the code of practice as a contractual clause within their tenancy agreements, and secondly, to include the ability within the contract to refer alleged breaches of that code to you for determination. So yes, you don't have a statutory role, but you could find yourself with a contractual role in terms of resolving those disputes. How do you see playing that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always reticent about reopening agreements to insert stuff because, with the greatest of respect to your sponsors, it tends to be the lawyers that sort of win out of changing agreements. I think if you're entering into a new agreement, I think that it would be an easily achieved sort of piece. I think there's potential for a midline discussion, George, where you sit down and say, I've got the code in front of me. I've potentially got the rock review in front of me. I've done my own analysis on how I feel things are going in the relationship. How do you feel they're going? And then ultimately, there could be a developed memorandum of understanding, a side letter, an exchange between landlord and tenant saying, we're going to try and live by the code and we're going to act reasonably and we're going to do this because we see that there's mutual benefit in there. What I would be nervous of is somebody in a 20-year agreement writing in that the code's going to be there and that they can refer to the commissioner's office for adjudication, and then in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, that the office doesn't exist and they're left pretty high and dry. And any lawyer in drafting, and you would see that, is to say, make sure it's got longevity to that. So that would be something I'd be slightly nervous of. But I think there's nothing to stop you phoning. In this context, we've got mostly tenants on the call, phoning your landlord's representatives and saying, I'd love to have a conversation about the code. I'd love to see and explore how we can do that better, or to codify that we're already got a great relationship and it's working well and that we'll continue it.
So Robert Graham has put a question up tonight, and he apparently has heard me say on many occasions that we don't need new legislation, but we do need more flexibility on how that's interpreted. I think he's particularly referring to my comments around the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995, which creates a wide freedom of contract for parties, and we're really only using a small aspect of that. And just to correct Robert on his question, we have a law commission review. We might have another webinar on that in a few months' time. And there are certainly aspects of legislation which we do think need to be updated, particularly on the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986. But Robert's right in that we are only using a small minority of the freedom of contract that we've got within the 1995 Act. And he wants to know whether you agree that landlords and landlords agents need to be persuaded to be more open with the flexibility that they've got within the legislation. Do you see that as part of your role?
I think landlords and their agents and tenants and their agents need to be innovative. I think where we are as a sector at the moment, there are a lot of challenges, being placed upon businesses, landowners, etc. A lot of change that probably hasn't happened in the past for a number of reasons. And I think the flexibility of the 95 Act should be being used by the whole sector. And I think the persuasion element is really interesting. It's ultimately working out what's in it for the other side. And where innovative ideas come forward and say, look, I can see you've got a problem with X, Y, and Z in your holding. I've got a challenge of A, B, and C in my holding. How can we bring this together for mutual benefit and really use that flexibility? And I don't see it's our role to talk about that as a persuasion. It's a between both parties. But I think flagging up to people who make decisions about letting land, about structures, that you are the right custodian of that ground, that the length of agreement can be there. I think there's a couple of tenants that I know, or a couple of names that I know on the attendees list who have had a very positive relationship with their landlord because they know exactly what they want to see on the ground. And that relationship puts them in a good place and gives them, more security. Now, I know that straight away you'll say, well, is it 3-year security or 7-year security or 10-year plus security? And those are the sort of things where I would like people to be encouraged to look at that flexibility and say, what is it that you actually need? We had rolling agreements within the Crown Estate. And it was basically, we know that there's some challenges coming our way as a landowner. How can you as a tenant have comfort that we're not going to do business with anybody else? but once something changes, that we both get what we need out of that piece of land. And I think that's the sort of encouragement, is to look at it with an open mind to see where that mutual success can be. But I'm not naive enough to realise that some people don't want to look at that side of things, and that's where the difficulty will be. I think that celebrating the flexibility that the 95 Act gives you and using it for mutual benefit is something we've got to be talking about.
Okay, I want to cover 3 or 4 specific areas that people have raised, and it may be something you don't want to comment on, or it may be something that you feel there's something you can add here. So we have Alistair Pinkerton tonight, who's on the webinar, who's talked about rent reviews particularly, and he has asked, should there be an industry-wide accepted timetable for tenants and landlords to respond to each other, particularly when matters are heading to arbitration? We know very well that rent reviews can drag on and on and on if the parties just don't engage with the process. Is that something you think you could help influence?
I think it's something the forum can discuss further. There was some feedback at the forum the other day about that type of thing. And I think ultimately, if we've got an evidence base to say that this is causing problems, it becomes more of an opportunity for me and the team to be able to influence on that. I remember in my year out in Northamptonshire with Bledsoe's doing statement of cases for rent reviews. And, I was asked to go back 3 and 5 years for data sets. And that I know that those reviews didn't get concluded in the time that I was there, and probably weren't concluded until much later. And that's something that I don't think is good for the sector, because, once you're 2 years past a review date, you're only a few months away from the next potential review. And that's just a lot of wasted time and angst from my perspective. So if we as a forum and the evidence can be there to have that wider discussion, I'm happy to be part of that discussion. I don't think it's for me to get into arbitration and rent review processes. There are other more formal reviews, like you've talked about, that are the right places for those things to come from. But again, if we've got the evidence there through the feedback that we're getting, we'll be in a better place than we've been in the past to have those discussions.
Okay, so another specific issue we've got, we have a bit of a flashpoint in the uplands, particularly at the moment, where we are seeing landlords looking to take back land to move into environmental goods and services in a big way, and using nefarious means to get tenants into position to be forced to do that. Do you think there's a role for you to support and promote a joined-up approach so that there's a symbiotic relationship between government funding, landlords and tenants to facilitate that confidence in government policy? And the Rock Review talked about this is an issue where landlords shouldn't have access to public money if they are bringing a tenancy to an end simply to move it into another scheme. Is that something where you can see some involvement?
It was something that the forum discussed the other week. We had some landscape partnership discussions with some of the DEFRA team and talking about how those could do. I think there are some really good best practice examples that can be teased out to show that you don't need to make the type of change that you're talking about. Again, it sounds like a stock answer, but I think this is about promoting where it works and showing that there's an alternate route rather than that removal of that tenant. Because ultimately, many of these upland recovery sort of schemes that we're talking about still need an active operator on the ground. And I think that there's a lot of situations where the best person to deliver the nature outcomes that are required probably looks very similar to the tenant farmer who has been there before. However, being really honest, there will be farmers that don't want to be part of those type of agreements, and they have to understand that that's a changing landscape, that the economy of that type of land has changed.
I should have said that was a member from Lancashire who raised that question. We've also got a member from Devon who's got another particular question. Often when a farm goes down with TB, there could be a difficult situation for both the landlord and the tenant at the end of a tenancy, because the animals can't be moved. And we have had a large number of circumstances where that can be a point of conflict between the landlord and the tenant, because the landlord wants the farm back and the tenant can't move the animals there's animal welfare, there's human welfare issues at stake there. Again, the question is that something that you feel that you could offer some guidance and advice and help to?
Yeah, and I think ultimately, if it's numerically, important to those members in those areas, I think it's that developing that understanding of why those are issues. So I was in Dumfries and Galloway during foot and mouth, and we had a tenancy coming to an end during foot and mouth cleanup, and the sort of statutory requirements of that were pretty robust. And there was no way that we could be doing anything with that holding, letting it, doing anything other. And the family had gone through, the loss of a full foot and mouth takeout. And I think for me, that's about how you engage with one another. You talked about the mental impact, the family impact, the social impact on that. As a trustee of Farms from Scotland, I want to see all of these conversations having a conscious impact assessment of what does this mean to the people on the ground? What does this mean to the individual, whether it be, because I think quite often landlords can be believed to be a sort of faceless entity, but quite often it's their personal circumstances that are being impacted as well as the tenants. And that's a conversation that we've had within DEFRA, we've had it at ministerial level, we've had it right across the pieces, is understanding what the people drivers are behind some of these decisions and trying to do them in as best a way as possible. The code doesn't deal with TB, those sort of restrictions, but ultimately it's about communication and collaboration. And if you've got a statutory legal, a requirement that overlays over and above a tenancy, there has to be a bit of pragmatism and realism.
Okay, and I'm sure you'll want to comment on this. We have a member in Worcestershire who has been a long-standing tenant farmer on an AHA agreement, has always had a rent invoice for the rent payable. He didn't get one this half year, and he asked the landlord's agent whether he could have one, and the landlord's agent simply responded, "You're not getting one. Rent is due whether it's demanded or not." I mean, how does that bring clarity and cooperation and collaboration?
The agent is correct. However, I think in terms of that best practice, it's about being that clear communication and having that and having clarity on the process of how to pay it is there. I don't want to get into tit for tat petty squabbles about different things that people say, but ultimately there must be a reason for that change, and it's worth understanding there. As you will always say to your members, George, pay your rent when it's due, and if you can't, make sure you're having that conversation. I think that there will be lots of examples where both tenants and their agents, and landlords and their agents say things that are not always entirely constructive and in line with the code. And I think we need to try and get beyond those to make sure that we're having those proper discussions and dialogues. And it might have been they were having a bad day and they follow up, say, look, that wasn't really helpful. Is there a reason for this? And I would like to see those type of relationships develop between landlord and tenant and their agents.
This might be a difficult one for you. I know where this question has come from. It was sent to me in advance. What do we do in circumstances where there is what I would call organized misconduct? And let me expand that euphemism a little bit. So we sometimes see, very sadly, the influence of things like Masonic order influence in certain communities where it's quite clear that things happen because of the Masonic influences. And those are really difficult things to work through. I mean, how do you see yourself working in situations where there is that type of influence going on here?
It's not something I've come across at all. And genuinely, George, didn't expect that sort of subject matter to come up tonight. I think if it's deliberate and sort of slightly institutionalized, that's where I have a concern about it. If it's becoming semi-formalized because of those, I don't think there's a lot of room for that within the code. And I think I would have to understand why that was the case. And ultimately, it's back to that. So how do we strip it back? How am I behaving? How are the other party behaving? And what are the drivers for that? And I'd have to understand a little bit more about that. It's not something I'd even heard of in discussion before. So yeah, that's a new one on me, I'm afraid.
I can talk to you about that offline. Getting back to maybe more jolly aspects of the role, John Witherley asks how you see maybe a role for voluntary local pub lunch clubs where landlords and tenants in a locality might interact informally and build relationships for landscape impact.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the Farmstrong sort of core ways to well-being is to connect with people, and ultimately having those conversations and having conversations in peacetime. The code word is, while everything's steady state. So if there can be informal discussions at your local discussion society, at your local show, coming together as landlord and tenant, informally, is a great place to be. There are some really good examples that I've already seen of where those relationships really do work. George, you were able to join us for the launch of the role with the Secretary of State down with David Exmoor. There are good examples where landlord and tenant are not sort of directly opposed to one another in certain aspects. And the more that those conversations can be done softly and in a different way, I'm all for that. Coming together with people of like mind and sharing best practice, I think that's great. I think if we could get more of those softer discussions happening, talking about the successes of the tenanted sector rather than the challenges, that's got to be a good thing.
This is one you might be able to answer quite quickly. Laura Nesfield from Agents BTF Partnership. How do you see the new role influencing or opining on rent levels?
There are very clear processes around rent reviews, as Laura Nesfield very well knows. And yeah, ultimately, I think it will be the sort of thing that we're able to feed back through the forum to DEFRA around activities. But I don't have capacity. I don't have a role to be setting rent levels, and we need to be really clear about where those formal processes sit.
And equally, we have another question from someone who's anonymous, but they've asked whether you've got a role in trying to influence DEFRA to expand the franchise for tenancy succession and bring other people into scope for that, particularly where maybe the close relative isn't the one who's doing the farming. I presume, again, like the rent levels, it's not something you really want to be getting involved with, but
it's not that I don't want to get involved in, it's not that it's not within the remit of my role, and I want to be able to have that impartiality on behalf of the tenanted sector for the tenants, for the landlords, but also from DEFRA, because otherwise if I start muddying the waters and getting involved in things that I shouldn't be getting involved in, that will start to say that from a DEFRA point of view, this is not success. So I think, there'll be other hooks in which that conversation can be hung on.
Okay, we're quickly getting to the end of our hour together here. You probably think some of the questions I've asked you already have been quite cheeky, but I'm going to ask you a final, very cheeky question before we conclude tonight. And that is, we've got Minette Batters coming to address us next month about her profitability report that she's doing for DEFRA. And clearly we've been talking to her about her report in the context of the tenanted sector of agriculture. If there was one helpful recommendation that she could put into her report that would also help you in your work, Alan, so one helpful recommendation that she could put into her report that could help you in your work, what would that be?
Oh, that is very difficult. I was before the announcement, I was in DEFRA's office quite a bit, and you could see Minette walking past thinking, why is Alan Laidlaw sitting in a DEFRA office the last 2 days? I'm not sure I've got a quick answer to that, actually, because there's so much nuance in what we're trying to do at the moment. I think, if Minette can make that cake bigger, that the slicing between landlord and tenant becomes more simple, then that's good. And I think to have a thriving agricultural sector, that profitability piece is really important. And Minette has spent a lot of time with a really good team pulling that together. So I think it's, remember the opportunity that the tenant farming sector can give to deliver multiple outcomes for different people. And I think that's the key and I think ultimately, just by me turning up to all my DEFRA colleague meetings, being at the forum, etc., it will remind people of the value of the tenant farming sector. And it will remind people how many farming businesses in England have an interest in tenant farming that quite often have been forgotten about. So I think it would be the same to DEFRA colleagues, to policymakers across the piece, as it would be to Minette, is don't forget the benefits of the tenant farming sector can give to what you're trying to achieve.
Alan, that's great. Thanks so much. You've been really generous with your time. You've answered lots of questions. There were a few others that we didn't get to that we might just ask you to answer maybe offline, and we'll put those up onto our website. But that was a tremendous insight into your role and how you see that operating. And I know on Thursday you're appearing in person with our friends at the NFU at their conference at the Three Counties Showground. And if you've liked tonight and you want to know more, and I don't know whether the NFU still got some places left, but I'm sure they'll be willing to extend some invitations to people if you want to go along to that and see Alan face to face. So yeah, really grateful to Alan for his time tonight, and also very grateful to Roy Thorne's solicitors for their sponsorship tonight. And as I was alluding to earlier, we have a webinar coming up on the 19th of November. So if you want to book in for that, that's a webinar with Baroness Minette Batters, who will be telling us all about the conclusions and recommendations that she's made on her farm profitability review. And we will also have I'm sure, a lively Q&A on what she has got to say. So we would certainly advise early registration for that. And if you're in Wales, and I know there are some Welsh members on the call tonight, and you are looking for a face-to-face meeting, then we've got a meeting at the Metropole Hotel in Llandrindod, Wales on Wednesday the 5th of November, where we'll be looking at the Welsh Government's new sustainable farming scheme, which is due to launch in January of next year. But all of our events are on our calendar on our website, which is tfa.org.uk, and there you can go to register. So I really do hope that you found tonight insightful. I certainly have. It's been really great to engage with Alan tonight. And we thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. Go back and watch it again if you want to get a bit more detail. So thank you so much for being with us, and see you next time. Good night.